Hello lovely people, welcome back to my kitchen laboratory. Today we will be testing some head units. When I started testing the Android head units, I always wondered how do proper head units perform. So I kind of invested, and thank you again for my Patreons and people that support me directly on PayPal. I bought these things, which are Alpine head units. So one of them is CDE-123R, which is an older model, much older, like probably, I don't know how old is it. If you know exactly how old this thing is, put in the comments, but I do believe it's something from before 2010s. And then another one, I have this one, which is UTE-200BT. So this one is still on Alpine official website, and you can still find it on Amazon for about $100. So both of these head units are kind of similar, but very different. So obviously the different age. This one is a CD unit, and the bottom one, it doesn't have any CD. And they have auxiliary inputs via 3.5mm jack, and they have USB inputs, and the bottom one has Bluetooth. This one probably has Bluetooth if you have like extra cable or something, because even old school Alpine head units had Bluetooth connection. And to measure them, I will be using my trusty Quant Asylum. So this is the software, how it looks like, and basically it's going to show me how clean these head units are. So we know from testing the Android head units is that the RCAs on Android head units is about 0.02% THD plus noise, and high level output on those is a bit more dirtier. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these measure, because I always wondered, are they very clean or are they not? Obviously these are not top of the range, these are budget, and a lot of people still rocking this, the 200BT, so I think it's going to be useful for them to know. And just to show you what's inside these head units, I literally took them apart, so let me show you very quickly. So there we have it, both of the units taken apart, and then you're going to look at this and you're going to say, oh my god, the old school head units had much more electronic there, much better, and the new ones have only this and nothing else. Not really, because this 95% of everything that's in here is the CD unit, because it is I have a CD, so you can have a look inside. There's just everything for the CD, and all the amplification and everything is just in this bit. So here you have a heatsink that has IC amplifier kind of attached to it, similar to that one, similar to all the other head units, and especially Android head units. Measure it, so I was not able to do that. However, for this one we can see it's very similar to an Android head unit in a way that it has only one motherboard, and then you have amplification chips. So the chip inside, I don't know if it will be visible, Toshiba TCB501H something. So I did have a look at this chip, and it is similar to the TDA chips. Performance-wise, it promises THD of like 0.006 or something, so very low THD, probably lower than the TDA, and we're gonna have a look, is this chip actually cleaner than the ones on the Android head unit? The other chip that you see on the right side that says LV something is just power supply something, linear power supply, whatever. And yeah, that's pretty much it. One of these chips might be a Bluetooth chip, I'm not sure. But as you can see, there's not much electronics, and you have high-level outputs and you have RCA outputs. So obviously we know that technology in 10 years improved quite a lot. However, everybody still says that old school head units have better quality than the new ones, because new ones, they started saving and everything, and it's not as good. So we're gonna see. It's gonna be a comparison between, maybe it's not gonna be fair to compare old school versus new school, but it's something like this. And as I mentioned, I will be measuring with Quant Asylum, so I do have this auxiliary jack in that's gonna go into each head unit, and I'm gonna be measuring RCAs, and then I have my load bank with a power supply. So this is a lithium battery sitting at 13.4 volts, and this is just resistors that I can plug and play. So we will have a look at the RCA outputs, and the high-level amplified output, and we will see which one is the cleanest. So let me make the measurements, and then we're going to jump into the laptop and we're going to see what we have. Just to show you very quickly how I take the measurements. So Quantasylum is connected into the RCA output. The signal is going into the auxiliary input. I have the volume control here. On the Quantasylum, I set the generator to output close to 1.5 volts. And you can see THD plus noise 0.02. If I'm going to crank up the volume all the way up to 35, the higher it goes, you can see it goes into clipping. We have THD of 0.2. It kind of starts to clip, and we have 2 volts output on the RCAs. So if I'm going to reduce it a little bit, maybe just to have just below 2 volts. Something like that. 2 volts, 0.02 THD plus noise, and it looks something like this. We're going to have a look at these graphs, and just very quickly, I just want to show you how I do one of the measurements for the THD versus level. So it is an automated measurement, your automated test, and we're going to choose amp THD versus input. So from -20 to +3, because I know up to 3 dBV it starts clipping. Increments 1, frequency, I'm not going to auto set, just leave it auto range at 18, and we're going to make the measurement. So it's going to take probably a minute, maybe less, just to go through all those, because you see it stops, run, and it takes measurement with every 1 dB increment. Just increases the level. Here you can see 14, 13, and it goes up, and it measures everything. We see the THD and THD plus noise, signal to noise ratio, the output of the RCA, so you can see it's always increasing, and after the measurements are done, it's going to give me a nice graph to look at. And there we go. This is the graph. So the only thing that we'll need to, you can see 0.2 something like 0.2, and then it starts to clip. So this is the RCA versus level, and we know that up till this point we have 2 volts. So I'll just make the graphs nicer. I'm going to take some more measurements, and I'm going to do exactly the same with the other head unit, and then we're going to have a look at the actual graphs. So since these graphs were done with the Quantasylum, they're slightly different than the ones done with the REW. The first difference is on the x-axis, we have dBV instead of volts. So it is slightly confusing, but we know that this, before clipping, corresponds to about 2 volts on both head units, corresponds to 2 volts of output. Now, on the left side, we have the UTE-200BT, which is the newer one. And on the right side, the CDE, which is the older model. And this is RCA outputs using analog inputs. Now, this is not probably the best way to use the head unit, because you need to feed a signal into it somehow. However, it's very good to see the capabilities of the RCAs, because most of the time, this is going to be the cleanest. Obviously, on the CDE unit, probably the CD would be the cleanest. However, I don't have CDs. I didn't have CDs for the past, I don't know, 15 years or so, so I really cannot test anything. But from this, we can see that using analog inputs, the newer head unit averages something like 0.02, 0.025, something like that, all the way for the whole range. And the old CDE model, it is much cleaner. It's something like 0.003 or something like that, or 2, even 2.5. So potentially 10 times as clean. So this, the CDE model, like this performance, is very close to a DSP, to a good DAC. And this, the 200BT, the newer model, is something similar as we saw with the Android head units as well, 0.2, 0.3, 0.02, 0.03, something like that. But it's not bad, but this is great. This is surprisingly great. If we're going to have a look at the THD versus frequency, for both, we have a very different picture. So the newer model, the 200BT, has a flat, so basically nothing changes on the higher frequencies, but this head unit has problems in the lower frequencies. So like you see, the distortion rises below 100 hertz, and at 20 hertz, we have close to 0.5% of distortion. So it has problems with the lower range. Now, the older model is a different picture. So it is the cleanest at the lower frequencies, and distortion slightly rises if you go higher with the frequency. So at 10K, we have 0.003, something like that. These are great numbers. We always see this rise on almost all amplifiers and DSPs, and for this one, it doesn't have any rise. The next one we're going to have a look is the frequency response. And this is exactly the same scale so that we could compare the actual responses. You can see the older model is basically flat throughout 2020, absolutely flat. This is 1 dB scale. So at 20 hertz, which is here, 20 hertz, it doesn't drop at all. And at the top end, at 20 kilohertz, which is here, it drops 0.2 dB, like a DAC, like a DSP, very, very super linear. And the newer, you can see that at 20K, it's already down by 1 dB, and then nothing, because this head unit is capped at 20K, and it doesn't reproduce anything above 20K. However, the older model goes all the way up to 48K because I measured with 96K. At the lower end, we have a very similar situation where at 20 hertz, we dropped 1.2 dB. So this is like 1 dB down at 20 hertz, it's nothing. And at 20 hertz as well, it's nothing. However, when you compare A to B, old versus new, the old wins hands down. Now we will be looking at the spectrum of the response. So this is a 1 kilohertz tone, auxiliary in, RCA out. And I chose something like 1 volt output on the RCAs. So because 2 volts is max, so like halfway is 1 volt. And from this we can see that the older one is much cleaner, miles cleaner compared to the new one. We have 0.004% THD plus noise, whereas the newer one is 0.025. And this, again, is, as I mentioned, very similar to the new Android head units that I tested. And this one, the older one, it's very good. We can see harmonics. The second harmonic is all the way minus 90, and the third one more than 100 down. This is a super clean signal. However, the problem is that I don't know what kind of scenario you would have that you would have to feed an analog signal into this head unit. But I think that CDs would perform identical to auxiliary, or even might a little bit better. Intermodulation distortion, very similar picture. We have the older one much cleaner compared to the newer one. Newer one has loads of different harmonics all the way here. For higher frequencies, exactly the same situation. The older one, super clean at high frequencies. And oh yeah, now I notice that the level of the signal is not the same. So these measurements might not be comparable directly. Yeah, so I have to forgive me because I'm still learning to use this software. And this is the first set of measurements that I did with the Quant Asylum. So I still need to get used to it. So let's disregard this. Now the other one. Okay, so newer model has the Bluetooth. The older one does not have Bluetooth. Well, it potentially can have, but I don't have it. So the Bluetooth connection, we're gonna have a look only at the newer one. The Bluetooth codec is something simple like SBC. There's no aptX or aptX HD, so it is quite limited. 1 kilohertz tone, we have THD plus noise 0.02. So kind of exactly the same as using auxiliary inputs. Nothing better on 1 volt. Just you can see the slightly more noise. With the intermodulation, we can see that there's loads of problems at the lower end. There's loads of noise all the way down to like minus 70, minus 80 dB. Loads of noise in the lower end. The top end, it looks kind of okay, but a little bit noisy. And the higher frequencies, as typical with the Bluetooth, so this is supposed to be two tones, 18 and 20 kilohertz, and we can see only one because after 18 kilohertz, everything is just chopped down for Bluetooth. So Bluetooth doesn't play up to 20K. And harmonics wise, it's not as bad, it's just very, very noisy. You can see all of these, they are below 100 dB, so it's kind of fine, but they're still there, so it's not as clean. And now we can go to the USB because I think USB is the most likely use case scenario for both of these head units, MP3s or whatever you're playing, and you just play music through there. So with the USB, we have a slightly different view in a way that the newer model on USB plays slightly better than the older model. See, we have 0.02 and all the older one 0.03 with the same 1 volt output on the RCAs. Now, my theory is that over 10 or 15 years, because there's a huge time difference between these two, the DACs got slightly better in the head units and cheaper. So potentially the newer DAC is a bit better than the older one, especially if you have to convert the files from USB sticks. Now the difference is not huge, and you can see this is the new one is very noisy as well as the old one, but the old one has these harmonics, but the new one has literally just noise. With intermodulation, situation is very, very similar. Again, the older one has slightly more harmonics, but noise-wise, it's kind of the same. For higher frequencies as well, the newer one performs better, and the older one has much more noise and much more harmonics. So on USB, the new one, the 200BT, wins this round. Not by much, by a very little, but wins. And if you remember the auxiliary input, it was the CDE that won. So these are the RCA outputs. Now let's have a look at the amplifier outputs. So I used a 1 kilohertz tone on a USB and just captured the output that was loaded down to 4 ohms. So you can see 4 ohms. This is just a capture of a point where the head unit goes kind of almost into clipping, because the only control I had is the volume knob on the head unit, and one click goes like from 0.02 all the way up to 1%, or in this case 0.5% and 0.8%. So I didn't have the granularity, but we can see the output is kind of the same where it starts to clip. So this is 0.4%, because if I put one click up, that's like 2 or 3%. So I chose this one, and for this is very similar, 0.8% THD. So it's very close to clipping. And we have 8 volts output, and it calculates as about 16-17 watts into 4 ohm static load. Now this number is slightly better than the Android head units. Those are starting to clip at about 15 watts or something, 10-15 watts. But again, that depends on voltage and the load. However, between these two and the Androids, conditions were kind of the same, so we can say that Alpines do give out a little bit more clean power, but literally just 2, 3, 4 watts more, not much. And here you can see the difference, how both of them are starting to clip. If we have a look at the clean signal, which was 5 watts, again, I couldn't dial it in, so this one, the newer one, is 5.3 watts, and the old one is 4.2 watts. I couldn't dial them in close to 5 watts. So this is the closest that I could get. And we can see that the difference is minimal, especially if we have a look at the numbers. So this is 0.028 and 0.033. Very similar. The newer one slightly cleaner, and we can see harmonics as well. So the second harmonics is -76, the third one -81 for the new one. For the old CDE model, the second harmonics -71 and the third one -80. So very similar. However, the older one has slightly more harmonics. But in general, the amplifier performance in both of these is very good. It is a bit noisy and stuff, but to have distortion at 0.03% is very good. Again, my measure of extremely good versus quite poor is between 0.01 and 0.1. So this, both of them fall in the bracket of good normal amplifiers, nothing special. However, the power is limited to, what, how much we saw that? 16 watts. Now, intermodulation, again, very, very similar, extremely similar result. There's no really big difference, at least I cannot see a big difference. And for higher frequencies, the same. Yeah, kind of the same result. Very, very slight difference, but kind of the same. So we can say that the amplifiers on both of these units perform almost identical. And the biggest difference is on the RCA outputs. So on the RCA outputs, if you use analog inputs or CDs potentially, the CDE-123R wins hands down because it's super clean, super flat, as we saw from everything. If you're using a USB stick, the newer one is slight edge over the old one, but very, very little. But in general, if we're comparing like the old school versus the new school, the old school wins. So this head unit is like probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years old or something. But the performance is very, very good, especially when you can get it. I bought it for 30 pounds. So if you can get this head unit for 30 pounds, use the RCA outputs, and it's going to be a super, super clean source for you. And it looks cool as well. So I hope this was informative for you, because I love doing these tests. I love doing these measurements. And for me, it was extremely interesting to see how old school performs to the newer school. As always, I would like to hear your thoughts as well. So please pop them in the comments below. And thank you very much for watching, guys. And I will see you in the next one.